Dylan Carter poured into his community and pursuing his passion for music.
Even though Dylan was young, he was so beyond his years in how you can be, more to your community.
He stood on one of the biggest stages in music television, barely 20 years old, singing a song he had tried and failed to finish at his own mother's funeral. Every judge turned their chair. He broke down in tears. The audience gave him a standing ovation. And in that moment, Dylan Carter wasn't just a voice contestant. He was a young man from South Carolina who had carried something unbearable in his chest and turned it into something beautiful. 3 years later, on the night of April 25th, 2026, he was gone. He was 24 years old, and the community he had poured himself into is still trying to make sense of a loss that nobody saw coming and nobody was ready for. The night everything stopped. There are moments that land differently depending on where you were when you heard them. For the low-country community of South Carolina, the stretch of coastal land that runs from Charleston down through Colleton County, the news of Dylan Carter's death arrived like something that simply could not be true. It was late on a Saturday night, April 25th, just before midnight. A 2026 Tesla sedan was traveling southbound on U.S. Route 21 in Colleton County when it veered off the road. It struck a utility pole. It hit a fence. Then it rolled. Dylan was the only person in the car. He was wearing his seatbelt. Emergency services responded, and he was transported to a hospital, but the injuries were too severe. The Colleton County coroner later confirmed that he died from blunt force injuries sustained in the crash. His death was ruled accidental. The South Carolina Highway Patrol opened an investigation, though nothing in the early reports suggested anything other than a single vehicle accident on a rural stretch of highway late at night. By Sunday afternoon, news had started spreading through social media, first locally, then nationally. The Local Voice, the nonprofit organization Dylan had co-founded to raise money for women fighting breast cancer, posted a statement that stopped people mid-scroll. They described him as the heart of everything they had built together. They said he believed every voice matters and lived that conviction every single day. The post was shared thousands of times within hours, not because of Dylan's national profile, but because of how many people in that region had known him personally. As a neighbor, as a performer, as someone who showed up. And then, in the final line, they offered a quiet comfort that said more about who Dylan was than almost anything else could. They said they found comfort knowing he was now in heaven with his mother. That single detail, the mother, is where this story actually begins. Because you cannot understand what Dylan Carter's death means without first understanding what his life meant. And that starts with a song he could not finish, and a stage that gave him a second chance to try. The audition that made 4 judges cry. Dylan Carter grew up in St. George, South Carolina, a small town about 50 miles northwest of Charleston. He grew up with music because his mother loved it, and one song in particular lived at the center of their relationship: Whitney Houston's 2009 gospel-inflected ballad, a song called "I Look to You." His mother loved it so much that when she thought about the end of her own life, she made one request. She wanted Dylan to sing it at her funeral. She died unexpectedly in October 2022. Dylan was 19 years old. He tried to sing the song at the funeral. He stood up in front of the people who had gathered to say goodbye to his mother, and he tried. He couldn't get through it. The grief was too immediate, too total, and the words wouldn't come without breaking completely. He sat back down without finishing, and he carried that with him. The unfinished song, the promise he felt he hadn't kept, into the months that followed. He had auditioned for The Voice before, not once, but twice, and hadn't made it to the blind audition stage either time. That kind of repeated rejection would discourage most people. The audition process alone is grueling. You travel, you wait, you perform under pressure, and you go home. He did that twice and came back a third time anyway. He submitted again, it for season 24 in 2023, and this time he made it through. And when he stepped onto that stage, he knew exactly what song he was going to sing and exactly what it meant. What happened next has been watched millions of times. He was 20 years old, standing in front of 4 of the biggest names in the music industry, about to sing a song that had broken him once before. Within the first few bars, Reba McEntire turned her chair, then Gwen Stefani, then John Legend, then Niall Horan, all 4. A clean sweep. The audience was on its feet, and Dylan finished the song, every word, every note, all the way to the end. And when it was over, the tears he had been holding back came anyway. He looked up at the ceiling, and he said he saw his mom when the chairs turned around. John Legend, visibly moved, told him that everyone in that room had felt what he was feeling. Reba McEntire shared a story about her own mother, her voice catching, and then told him that mamas are so special. Dylan chose Reba as his coach. She would go on to call him her dear friend, a phrase she used again publicly when she paid tribute to him after his death. Gwen Stefani and John Legend were also visibly emotional during the exchange, which is notable because these are people who sit through hundreds of auditions each season and are well practiced at keeping their composure. Dylan Carter's 2 minutes on that stage did something to all of them. He was eliminated in the battle rounds, which is further into the competition than it sounds. By the time the battles come around, the field has already been heavily thinned, but his elimination was never really the point. What he had already done on that stage, in those few minutes, was the thing. He had finished the song. The life he built after the spotlight. What a lot of people don't know about Dylan Carter is what he did after The Voice. For many reality television contestants, the show is the ceiling, the biggest moment they'll ever have, and everything that follows is spent chasing it or mourning it. Dylan wasn't built that way. He went back to South Carolina, back to the low country, back to the community he had grown up in, and he got to work. He got his real estate license and built a client base, even leaning into the overlap between his 2 identities. He called himself the singing realtor on social media, which tells you something about how lightly he wore both parts of who he was. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, someone who did not take himself too seriously, but took his responsibilities to others very seriously indeed. He became a co-owner of Sunny Days RV and Campground near Lake Marion in the Santee community, a practical, roots-down investment in the region he came from. He kept performing, not on national television stages, but at local events, fundraisers, town concerts, the kinds of shows where the audience is made up of people you'll run into at the grocery store the following weekend. He was scheduled to perform at the Town of Moncks Corner's Music on Main Event on the Monday after his death. The fact that he was booked for a free community concert 2 days before he died says something specific about the kind of musician he chose to be. He could have spent those years chasing bigger stages. He chose the ones closest to home. When the town announced the event had been canceled, the mayor, Thomas Hamilton Jr., posted a tribute describing Dylan as a gifted singer whose kindness and charm had earned him immense respect. That's not the language people use for someone who passed through a community. That's the language they use for someone who belonged to it. And then there was the local voice. Dylan co-founded it with others who shared his belief that people in small communities deserved the same level of care and support that people in bigger cities took for granted. The organization specifically supports women battling breast cancer, which, given that Dylan had lost his own mother, was not an abstract cause. It was personal. He poured energy into it, gave it his name and his platform and his time, and it grew into something real enough that the organization's statement following his death was one of the most widely shared pieces of writing about him. He didn't just put his name on a cause, he was the cause. The picture that emerges from all of this is of someone who used the brief visibility The Voice had given him not as a springboard to personal fame, but as a foundation for a life of genuine usefulness. He was 24 years old and had already built more than most people manage in decades. What the Lowcountry lost. The response to Dylan Carter's death in the days following April 25th was not the kind of response that gets manufactured by publicists or coordinated by management teams. It was the organic, unscripted outpouring that happens when a community loses someone who was genuinely woven into it. The town of Moncks Corner didn't just cancel his concert. The mayor posted a tribute that described Dylan as far more than an entertainer, as a friend to the entire community. Local radio stations in the Charleston area ran tributes. Former neighbors and classmates from St. George shared memories going back years. People who had bought homes through him as a realtor talked about what it had been like to work with someone who was that enthusiastic about helping people find a place to belong. People who had attended local voice events described a young man who showed up not as a celebrity doing a good deed, but as a neighbor doing his part. One detail that circulated widely was that Dylan had previously tried to get onto The Voice twice before succeeding, and that quiet persistence, the refusal to accept the first or second no, felt like it captured something essential about how he approached everything in his life. He was not someone who folded when things didn't go his way. He came back every single time. Reba McEntire, who had coached him on The Voice and stayed in contact in the years since, posted on her social media that she would miss Dylan deeply. She called him brilliant, kind, and talented. She said he brought a huge ray of sunshine to The Voice and signed off with the words, "Rest in peace, my dear friend." For someone of Reba McEntire's stature to describe a battle-round contestant as a dear friend years after the show ended, unprompted, in her own words, says something clear about the impression Dylan left, not just during filming, but in everything that followed. She was not the only one from the show who responded. The Voice's coaches and production community acknowledged his passing across multiple platforms, each tribute adding another layer to the picture of a young man who had made a genuine impression on people who meet a great many talented singers every single season. The Voice's official channels also pointed back to his audition, described at the time as one of the most emotionally affecting moments of season 24. The comment sections that followed the tribute posts were full of viewers describing exactly where they were when they first watched it, and how it had stayed with them in the years since. That kind of long-term emotional residue is rare. Most auditions, even strong ones, fade. His didn't. What makes all of this particularly hard to sit with is the sheer scale of what was still ahead of him. Dylan was 24. He had already demonstrated a capacity for community building, authentic connection, and turning personal grief into purposeful action that would be remarkable in someone twice his age. The local voice, the real estate career, the music, the campground, these were not the scattered efforts of someone still figuring out what they wanted. They were the early chapters of a life that had found its shape. The people around him knew it. His community knew it. And now they are left to carry forward what he started, without the person who built it. The local voice confirmed they will continue the mission in his honor. That is both a tribute and a weight. Apologies for the frustration. Here is the segment with exactly 180 words added, nothing padded. The song, the mother, and what it all means. There is something that sits at the center of Dylan Carter's story that is impossible to move past without acknowledging directly, because it is what transforms this from a tragedy into something that means more than just loss. Dylan's mother died in October 2022. She had asked him to sing "I Look to You" at her funeral, a Whitney Houston ballad about finding strength through faith when everything feels like it is collapsing. He tried. He stood in front of everyone who had gathered to say goodbye to her, and he opened his mouth, and he could not get through it. The grief was too fresh, too enormous, and the song broke before it could finish. He sat back down, and he carried that unfinished moment, the song he owed her and couldn't deliver, into every month that followed. When he finally stood on the Voice stage in 2023, he didn't pick a song to impress the coaches. He didn't pick something current or strategically safe. He picked the one he owed his mother, and he finished it. In front of 4 of the biggest names in music, in front of a television audience of millions, with every judge's chair turned toward him and an arena full of strangers on their feet. He finished it, and when the last note landed and the emotion broke through, he looked up and said he saw her when those chairs turned around. That is not a television moment. That is a human being completing something that grief had left unfinished. The nonprofit he co-founded, The Local Voice, raised money specifically for women fighting cancer. His mother's death had shaped that commitment directly, and every dollar raised through that organization, every woman who received support, carried his grief forward as something useful rather than just something painful. When the organization posted its tribute after Dylan died, they said they found comfort knowing he was now with his mother. Whatever one believes about what comes after, that framing reflects something true about how Dylan lived, as someone for whom his mother's absence was not just a wound but a direction. Her death didn't just break something in him, it told him where to go. It is also worth sitting with what he was still building when he died. He was actively recording original music, including material he had been sharing with fans online. His real estate business was growing, the campground was operating, the nonprofit was expanding. He had a gig booked for the Monday after he died. He was not coasting on a television moment from 3 years earlier. He was in the middle of something, multiple somethings. None of those threads had reached their end. And that, more than anything else, is what makes this so hard to absorb. Not just that he is gone, but that so much of what he was building had not yet had the chance to become what it was going to be. What also deserves to be said is how rare it is for someone so young to have already connected grief, purpose, and community so deliberately. Most 24-year-olds are still working out who they are. Dylan had already answered that question through the cause he built, the music he kept making, the people he kept showing up for. He had taken the most painful thing that ever happened to him and built something lasting out of it. The Local Voice will continue. The women it supports will continue receiving care. The community he helped shape will carry his name forward. That is not a small legacy. That is a meaningful one, built by someone who never had the time most people take for granted. And here is the part that sits heaviest of all. Dylan was scheduled to perform a free concert for his community 2 days after he died. The people who would have been in that audience, neighbors, friends, families, were instead reading tributes on their phones. The stage was ready. The set list was probably already written. The song he had once failed to finish at his mother's funeral had become the foundation of everything he built. And now, both the builder and the building stand as a reminder that some people do more with 5 years than others do with 50. He was 24 years old. He had lost his mother at 19, and in the 5 years between those two facts, he built enough that an entire region of South Carolina stopped when they heard the news and reached for language about reunion rather than just loss. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Dylan Carter turned an unfinished song into a finished life, and the life itself, even cut this short, was more than most people leave behind. If this story moved you, drop Dylan's name in the comments so his community knows how far his story has traveled. And tell us, what do you think his mother would have said watching those 4 chairs turn around that night? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.